They laughed before she even opened her mouth, not because they knew her, but because they didn't. And in a world that often underestimates black women, Amara Bennett had grown used to the sound of doubt. But tonight, she was done shrinking. The lights above the stage cast a pale gold glow over the wooden floorboards as Amara stood behind the curtain, her heart pounding like a snare drum. She had performed this piece 100 times, alone in her bedroom, in the mirror, in front of her father, but never like this. Never on a stage this prestigious. The Uptown Artists Showcase wasn't just another open mic. It was where careers were born and broken. In the front row sat her father, Marcus Bennett, a man of few words but immeasurable presence. A retired professor of African American studies, Marcus was the kind of man who spoke with his eyes, even when his mouth stayed shut. He wore his navy blue suit, pressed and neat, with a folded white handkerchief in his breast pocket, the one he only wore on important days. Amara had written her monologue herself, a raw, emotional piece about black womanhood, loss, and finding one's voice. It was powerful, real, and unapologetically hers. But she knew it wouldn't be an easy sell in a room like this. The panel of judges, 2 men and 1 woman, all white, all well-known casting directors, sat with their arms folded and faces unreadable. A few seats away, a group of industry interns whispered among themselves, passing judgments before she even took her first step. As the stage manager nodded at her, she took a deep breath and walked out. Her heels clicked against the wood, steady but cautious. She felt a wave of tension sweep across the room, eyes scanning her from head to toe, not with curiosity, but with calculation. Amara wasn't the typical darling of this scene. She was darker, bolder, louder in spirit, and they could feel it. She opened with the line, "They tell me to be softer, but I was born from storms." Her voice rang clear, but the reaction from the judges was muted. One of them even smirked. She pushed forward, delivering the pain, the fire, the history etched into every syllable. Her cadence was strong, her gaze unwavering. Yet beneath the performance, she could feel it, that cold resistance, that same ancient chill that told women like her they didn't belong here. But in the front row, her father never blinked. He leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes locked on hers. That was her anchor. The room might doubt her, but he never did. As she moved toward the climax of her piece, the whispers got louder. Laughter, not at her words, but at her. Something in the crowd shifted. She could feel the air thickening. And though her voice started to shake, she refused to stop. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to witness a moment that would not only change her future, but silence the entire room. It started with a smirk, a small, smug curl of the lips from the middle judge. That's all it took to send a ripple of dismissal through the room, like her pain was performance art and her truth just an inconvenience. Amara stood center stage, mid-monologue, her body tense and voice cracking slightly at the edges. Her words, crafted from years of lived experience and emotional excavation, should have held the weight of thunder. Instead, they were being swallowed by a storm of sneers. One of the judges leaned toward the others and whispered something. They chuckled. Amara saw it. So did her father. The audience, at first polite, began to shift in tone. A few scoffs, then soft laughter. Some folded their arms, others leaned back in their chairs like they were watching a failed audition reel. She tried to push through it. Her monologue, centered on a fictional character named Asha who battles through grief and racial trauma, was meant to leave the room in stunned silence. But this room, it was filled with gatekeepers who didn't want to be challenged, who wanted entertainment, not confrontation. She was giving them fire and they were throwing ice. She's so intense, one of the interns whispered audibly, not even bothering to mask it with a hand. Amara stumbled for just a second. A flicker in her voice. She looked toward the judges, hoping, pleading for at least a nod of respect. Instead, the woman on the panel cocked her head and raised an eyebrow, like she was watching a car commercial that didn't quite land. She tried to refocus. Asha buried her mother in silence because the doctors wouldn't listen to her pain. Man in the third row chuckled. That did it. Something inside Amara snapped, not in anger, but in heartbreak. She paused mid-sentence. For a moment, she couldn't remember the next line. It wasn't stage fright, it was stage betrayal. In the audience, her father sat frozen. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the sides of his chair. For decades, he had watched rooms like this undermine people like his daughter. He had taught about bias in classrooms, marched in protests, written papers no one in power wanted to read. But this was different. This was personal. Amara's voice dropped to a whisper. Asha screamed, but no one heard her. Another giggle. This wasn't criticism. It was mockery. They weren't judging her technique. They were dismissing her truth, because it made them uncomfortable, because it came from a body and a voice they didn't value. In that moment, Amara stood not just as an actress, but as a mirror, and they hated what they saw. She looked down, about to skip to the end of her monologue and exit with whatever dignity she had left. And then, she heard it. A chair creaked, a presence shifted, and a voice, calm but commanding, rang out through the stunned auditorium. That is my daughter. The room froze. That voice didn't rise. It cut, calm, clear, and firm, like thunder that chose its moment. Every head turned. Because whoever had just spoken hadn't just interrupted the show, he had changed the story. Marcus Bennett stood slowly, his hand steady on the head of his polished wooden cane. At 6'2", with a posture straight as principle, he didn't look like a man who had come to watch. He looked like a man who had come to speak. Amara turned toward the voice, breath catching in her throat. Her father had never interrupted anything in his life. Not a classroom, not a church service, not even her own rehearsals. But now, with the whole room staring, he stepped forward, one row at a time. The audience parted like water. No one dared speak. Even the judges perched, smugly above the stage, leaned forward as if to assess the threat. But Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That, he said, gesturing to Amara without looking at her, is my daughter, and what she's giving you is a gift. A stunned hush fell. He stepped up to the foot of the stage, now in full view. She wrote that monologue not for your entertainment, he continued, voice even but heavy with history, but from a place most of you have never had to reach. You laugh because you don't understand, or maybe because you do, and you're ashamed to admit it. A murmur rose from the back of the room. People were filming now, phones raised, breaths held. I taught African American literature for 30 years, Marcus went on. I've read James Baldwin's Fire and Bell Hook's Grace. I've studied Toni Morrison's Layered Pain, and I'm telling you now what you're witnessing is the same lineage, truth told through a black woman's voice. He turned briefly to the judges. You mock her gestures, her tone? That is the language of a people who've had to shout just to be seen. Her voice isn't too loud. It's been made louder by centuries of silence. The woman on the panel opened her mouth, then closed it. A few in the crowd began to nod. Others clapped, tentatively at first, then with growing force. It wasn't polite applause. It was the sound of realization, of shame trying to right itself. Amara stood frozen in place, tears threatening to spill, but pride holding them in place. Her father wasn't dramatic. He wasn't loud. But when he spoke, people listened, and right now every person in the theater was listening. He looked back at his daughter. Finish your story, baby. Let them hear it all. Then he turned, walked back to his seat, and sat with the same quiet dignity he had always carried, only now the room bore witness to it. The lights dimmed again, and Amara began to speak. This time, no one laughed. They leaned in, not out of politeness, but because they finally understood the power of the voice they tried to ignore. Amara drew in a breath, no longer shaky. The lines that had nearly slipped from her mind moments ago returned, sharp and steady. She stepped forward, voice fuller now, not loud but resonant. Her father had done what no one else dared, reminded the room that truth doesn't beg to be heard, it demands it. As she recited the rest of the monologue, something changed in the air. Her words struck differently. The same piece that was mocked minutes ago now rippled through the theater like poetry finding its home. Asha stood at the grave, knowing her cries were unheard, not because they weren't loud enough, but because no one cared to listen, Amara said, her eyes sweeping the crowd. She wasn't broken, she was buried. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable, reverent. The judges said nothing. For once, their expressions were unreadable for the right reasons, because their authority had been quietly stripped away. One judge began to write something but quickly put the pen down. Another sat back in their chair, arms uncrossed now, as if defenses were no longer justifiable. Amara's final lines hit like a revelation. "I will not shrink to fit your stage. If the spotlight blinds you from my truth, then you were never ready for the show." She held her last pose for a moment, and the theater erupted, not with forced applause, not with half-hearted appreciation, but with real, honest, echoing claps that filled the room with something electric: respect. A woman in the balcony stood first, then a man in the third row. Before long, a full standing ovation shook the room. People who had chuckled earlier now looked at her with something new in their eyes: guilt, admiration, awe. Backstage, several performers stood with mouths open, watching what they'd assumed would be a crash and burn become a phoenix moment. Amara walked off the stage slowly, soaking it in. Not the applause, but the silence it replaced. That silence, once full of judgment, had turned into something sacred, and at the edge of the wings, her father stood waiting. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He wrapped his arms around her, and she let the tears fall, quietly, into the chest of the only man who had ever truly seen her. By sunrise, millions had watched it. Not her monologue, but the moment her father stood and made the world do the same. The video spread like wildfire. Someone had captured it all: the mockery, the silence, the interruption, and the speech that followed. Overnight, it was on every social media platform, every blog, every outlet that normally ignored stories like hers. Professor silences judges who mocked daughter on stage. A father's stand, viral moment sparks cultural reckoning. Amara didn't wake up famous, but she woke up seen. Her inbox exploded. Independent filmmakers, theater collectives, spoken word organizations, even a few apologetic agents, all wanted to talk. Not just about the monologue, but about the voice behind it. The mind that wrote it. The woman who endured that moment with grace and fire. She accepted none of the immediate offers. Instead, she accepted an invitation to speak. At a university, ironically one of the schools that once rejected her application. Her father introduced her on stage. This time the applause came before she even said a word. The theater where it all happened reached out to repair the damage. She declined politely, telling them, "You don't get to rewrite a scene just because it makes you uncomfortable." As for the judges, one resigned quietly. Another issued a public statement. The third disappeared from public view altogether. But Marcus? He went back to his usual routine: morning tea, crossword puzzles, and long walks in the park. When reporters called, he'd say, "I didn't do anything special, I just stood up." And yet, to Amara, that moment changed everything. Not because he defended her, but because he reminded her that truth doesn't need permission to be heard. It just needs one person brave enough to speak when silence is easiest. Her next performance wasn't at a showcase, it was her own one-woman show, sold out in days. Its title, "The Moment They Laughed," and beneath it, in fine print, "Dedicated to the man who stood."